Cottonwood Springs lay stretched beneath a punishing known sun, its single red dirt street shimmering as though the ground itself breathed heat. Weathered buildings leaned inward like tired men, porches sagging, paint peeled to gray bones. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and old smoke. Nothing moved quickly here, not time, not judgment. Men lounged outside the saloon, wide-brimmed hats tipped low, cigarettes dangling from their lips. Their eyes followed everything. Women passed in small knots, skirts brushing the dirt, voices lowered but sharp. In Cottonwood Springs, whispers traveled faster than horses. And they traveled most often toward Annie Callahan. She stepped onto the boardwalk with measured calm, boots striking the wood in a steady rhythm. Each step landed firm, unapologetic. Annie was a plus-size black woman of 22, her body strong and full in a way the town had decided was wrong for a woman to be. Her faded gray dress clung to her curves, frayed at the hem from years of mending, dust already gathering where the fabric brushed her boots. She walked with her chin lifted, back straight, not because she was unafraid, but because she refused to bend. "There she goes," someone murmured from a shaded porch. "That Callahan woman. Too big, too bold. No man would ever take her. Not wife material." The words drifted after her, light as breath, yet heavy as chains. Annie did not turn her head. She never did, but her ears caught every syllable. They always had. Since she was a girl, the town had taught her what it saw when it looked at her. Excess, impropriety, trouble, a body that took up too much space and a spirit that refused to shrink. At 17, she had been called wild for swimming in the creek with boys her age, laughter ringing under the sun, innocence twisted into sin by hungry eyes. At 19, she had bloodied the nose of a rich white boy who tried to corner her behind the abandoned schoolhouse. No one asked why she fought. They only remembered that she did. From then on, the judgment stuck. Strength became vulgar. Work at the saloon became shame. Her size became proof. Her skin became the verdict. Annie passed a group of young women giggling together, white dresses crisp and clean, their laughter light as bells. They leaned into one another, whispering, dreaming aloud of dances, proposals, church aisles. They would be chosen. They would be called good wives, good mothers, good women. Annie felt the familiar ache bloom in her chest, quick, sharp, and buried just as fast. She reached the general store and stepped inside. The bell rang once, shrill in the stillness. Mrs. Winters glanced up, her eyes flicking over Annie's figure, before turning away with a stiff huff, hands busying themselves with tins already in order. "Afternoon," Annie said politely. No answer came. She gathered her supplies, placed her coins on the counter, and left without waiting. Outside, the wind lifted, whipping red dust around her skirt, clinging to her boots, her calves, her name. No man would take her. The sentence followed her like a brand. Then the sound cut through everything. Hoofbeats, fast, decisive, unmistakable. Heads turned, the men straightened, dust lifted into the air like smoke. Out of the haze rode a tall cowboy, his posture straight in the saddle, coat worn but clean, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. He reined in his horse without thinking, his gaze settling on her and holding. Annie felt it before she understood it. The air shifted, her breath caught. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. What met her was not the look she knew so well. There was no leer, no mockery, no calculation, no contempt, only a steady, unflinching regard. He saw her, not as rumor, not as excess, not as a lesson, simply as a woman standing in the street. Annie's fingers tightened around the handle of her basket. Her heart gave a sudden, unfamiliar tremor. In all her years, no man had ever looked at her without measuring her worth against the town's cruel scale. This stranger did not weigh her. He only looked.
For a heartbeat, Cottonwood Springs vanished. There were no whispers, no laughter, no dust. Only the steady blue of his eyes and the quiet strength in the way he held himself. Then, as simply as he had stopped, the cowboy tipped his hat. A small gesture, respectful, deliberate, and rode on. The sound of hooves faded down the street. The town exhaled. Murmurs resumed, sharper now, curious, irritated. Who does he think he is? Did you see him looking at her? Must not know her reputation. Annie stood still a moment longer, her pulse loud in her ears. She told herself it meant nothing. Strangers passed through all the time. Kind looks were not promises. Hope was dangerous. But as she turned and continued down the street, something inside her had shifted. Quiet, fragile, undeniable. For the first time, someone had looked at Annie Callahan and not turned away. And though she did not yet know his name, the cowboy who rode into Cottonwood Springs that day had already changed the course of her life.
Elias Dawson had crossed enough country to know when a place was honest in its ruin. Cottonwood Springs greeted him with a single red dust street and a line of tired wooden buildings slouched beneath the sun. The air shimmered with heat, and the people watched him the way towns always watched strangers, with curiosity edged by calculation. Elias felt none of it press him. After 10 years driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, sleeping under open skies, and trusting his life to men he barely knew, small-town judgment meant little. He dismounted at the livery stable, the scent of hay and sweat thick in the air. A boy no more than 12 came running, eager and sharp-eyed. "Fine horse, mister. Must have come a long way." "Far enough," Elias replied, handing over the reins. "Think you can handle him?" "Yes, sir." The boy worked quickly, then glanced up. "You new here?" "Elias Dawson, name's mine. Just bought the Miller Ranch." The boy's eyes widened. "That place? Folks say it's cursed. Man died alone there." Elias shrugged. "Land doesn't curse people. People do that well enough themselves." The boy hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret that mattered. "If you need help fixing it up, there's someone you should know." Elias studied him. "I'm listening." "Annie Callahan. She's strong, stronger than most men here. Rides like she was born in the saddle. Shoots straighter than my pa." Elias lifted a brow. "Then why isn't she working steady?" The boy scuffed his boot in the dirt. "They won't hire her proper." "Why?" A pause, then the truth, spoken quick. "She's black, and she's big. Folks say she ain't wife material, say she's trouble." Something hardened behind Elias's eyes. He'd heard many versions of that sentence across the trail, words used to keep people small, convenient lies dressed up as tradition. "And what do you think?" Elias asked. The boy made his gaze. "I think they're wrong." Elias nodded once. "So do I." Later that afternoon, he stepped into the saloon. The room was dim, thick with the smell of old whiskey and smoke. A few men slouched at tables, boots crossed, hats low. Behind the bar, the bartender polished a glass that would never shine. Then the door swung open again. Annie Callahan carrying a basket of folded tablecloths. She moved with purpose, her body solid and grounded, each step measured. Elias recognized her instantly, the woman from the street, the one the town whispered about. Up close, she was nothing like the stories. Her frame was full, powerful, built for work. Her skin was sun-darkened, her expression composed, eyes steady and alert. There was no slouch to her posture, no apology in the way she occupied space. If anything, she carried herself like someone long used to standing alone. Elias watched her as she set the basket down and spoke quietly to the bartender. No flirtation, no bravo, just work. This was not a woman reckless with her reputation. This was a woman stripped of one. When he spoke, it was without preamble. "I need someone to help rebuild a ranch." The saloon went still.
Annie turned slowly. Her eyes met his, guarded but clear. "You know what they'll say," she said. Elias held her gaze. "I don't hire rumors." Her lips pressed together. "They'll say you're foolish, hiring a woman like me." "I judge with my own eyes," Elias answered evenly, "not with other men's ears." The words settled heavy in the room. A man at the far table scoffed. The bartender frowned and looked away, but Elias did not glance at either of them. His attention stayed on Annie alone. She studied him for a long moment, weighing him the way he had weighed land. Strangers made offers all the time. Most came with strings, with expectations, with pity or hunger. This man offered neither. "I haven't said yes," she said at last. "And you haven't said no," Elias replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. Annie lifted her basket and walked past him, pushing through the batwing doors without another word. The last light of day caught the dust on her skirt before she disappeared. Elias exhaled slowly. Outside, the street buzzed with renewed whispers. He felt them brush past him like flies. He ignored all of them. He knew what he had seen. Not a woman defined by gossip. Not a body to be judged. Not a reputation to be feared. A worker, a survivor, a woman standing in her own strength despite the weight pressed against her. That evening, as the sun bled copper across the horizon, Elias walked the edge of the land that would soon be his. The Miller Ranch lay quiet, broken, waiting. He could rebuild the fences, patch the roof, mend a barn, but something else stirred beneath his ribs. In all his years on the trail, Elias trusted his sight to keep him alive. It had never failed him yet. And when he thought of Annie Callahan, her steady gaze, her measured voice, the way she walked through contempt without bending, he knew one thing with certainty. Cottonwood Springs had been wrong about her, and he intended to prove it. At first light, Annie Callahan stood outside her shack beneath the thin shade of birch trees, fastening the last strap on the small chest that held nearly everything she owned. The morning air carried a dry chill, sharp against her skin. She moved with quiet efficiency, folding her worn dresses, tucking in her father's old dagger, laying her scraps of paper carefully on top as though they mattered as much as food. She rested her hand on her mare's neck, steadying herself. The road ahead was uncertain, and uncertainty had never been kind to her. Still, she mounted without looking back. The Miller Ranch rose out of the flatland like a tired animal, fences leaning, boards warped, roof sagging in surrender. Weeds swallowed the yard whole. Annie drew her horse to a halt, studying the place with clear eyes. It was worse than she'd imagined. But it was honest. Elias Dawson was already there, sleeves rolled, hammer ringing against rotten wood. He paused when he saw her approach. No surprise crossed his face, only quiet satisfaction. "You came," he said simply. "I said I hadn't said no," Annie replied, dismounting. He nodded toward a small cabin beneath the birches. "That one's yours. Frame solid. Needs work." Annie stepped inside. The space was bare, rusted bed frame, cracked window, hearth choked with dust. No judgment watched her here. No whispers pressed against the walls. "It'll do," she said. And so the work began. They cleared the barn first, hauling out broken beams, dragging debris into the sun. Annie's movements were efficient, practiced. She lifted with her legs, not her back. She didn't rush, didn't complain. Sweat darkened her shirt, dust clung to her skin, but her pace never faltered. Elias noticed everything. She set posts straighter than the men he'd worked with on cattle drives. She tamped earth firm and level. When a beam splintered, she adjusted without asking, solving the problem before it could be named. By noon, their arms ached and their clothes were streaked with grime. Elias paused to wipe his brow and watched Annie sink her shovel cleanly into the earth, shoulders rolling with controlled strength. "You've done this kind of work before," he said. "I've done whatever kept me standing," she answered. The truth of it struck him harder than any boast. By afternoon, the ranch looked different, not restored, but awakened. Weeds lay cut, fence lines stood marked, piles of salvageable timber waited in neat stacks. As the sun dipped low, Annie pulled off her boots and sat on the step of her cabin, breathing deep. Elias stood nearby, hands on his hips, surveying the land. "You work as hard as any man," he said, not as flattery, but fact. Annie lifted her chin. "Harder than some." He laughed, a short, genuine sound. Something eased between them then. Not employer and laborer, not benefactor and charity. Equals. That night, Annie built a small fire and set an iron pot above it. She moved with quiet familiarity, stirring dried beans, adding what vegetables she had brought. The scent rose warm and grounding. Elias accepted the bowl she handed him, tasted, then looked up in surprise. "This is good." She shrugged. "My mother taught me to make do." He scraped the bowl clean. The fire crackled. Smoke drifted upward into the dark. They spoke little, but the silence was not empty. It settled around them like something shared. Over the following days, the rhythm held. They rose with the sun, worked until it fell. Annie split fence holes, hauled water, rode the perimeter of the land to mark damage. When rain threatened, she suggested shifting tasks. When supplies ran low, she rationed without being asked. Elias watched as the ranch bent around her presence, responding. She never asked for praise, never asked for leniency. When her hands blistered, she wrapped them and returned to work. When her muscles burned, she breathed through it and kept going. He had known men who broke faster. One afternoon, Elias paused beside her as she set a fence post. Most folks would have quit by now. She didn't look up. Quitting was never an option. The weight behind the words hung heavy. That evening, as dusk spread violet across the prairie, they sat near the fire again. Annie stirred the stew with practiced calm. Elias studied her face in the firelight, tired, smudged with dirt, yet carrying a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with beauty or approval. This was not a woman defined by her size, or her skin, or the lies told about her. She was defined by what she did when no one clapped. Elias understood something then, with clarity that settled deep in his bones. Hiring Annie Callahan was not an act of defiance against the down. It was an act of truth. The Miller Ranch breathed again, not because of tools or timber, but because two people worked it without hierarchy, without apology. And in the steady labor of those days, something stronger than fences was being built. Not yet love, but respect, laid deep and level, like a foundation meant to last. The harvest dance arrived with the kind of excitement that only Cottonwood Springs could summon. For weeks the town had hummed with preparation. Lanterns were scrubbed clean, oil lamps polished until they shone, and the town hall, usually plain and forgettable, was dressed in wreaths of dried corn and bundles of wheat tied with twine. The harvest dance was more than a celebration. It was a stage, a place where worth was measured in glances, gossip, and who stood beside whom. Annie Callahan knew that better than anyone. She stood alone in her small cabin as twilight settled, the green-blue dress laid carefully across her narrow bed. The fabric caught the last of the daylight, soft and new beneath her fingers. She'd never owned anything like it, not since her mother had stitched dresses by lamplight long ago. For years she had worn what could be mended, patched, stretched to last another season. This dress was not extravagant, but it was chosen. Annie pressed her palms to the cloth, her chest tight. She could already hear the whispers, feel the eyes. She knew what they would say, that she had no right to stand among them, that her body made her unfit for lace and lamplight, that a woman like her should remain in shadow. She almost folded the dress away, but then she remembered Elias's voice, steady and sure. "I trust my own eyes." Annie dressed slowly. When she tied the white ribbon at her hair, her hands trembled, not with fear alone, but with resolve. She looked once at her reflection in the cracked glass. A black, plus-size woman stared back, strong, solid, unhidden. She did not look away. The town hall glowed against the darkening sky, lanterns casting warm halos across the porch. Inside, fiddles played quick and sharp, boots stomped time against the wooden floor, and laughter rose in bright bursts. The room was full, white dresses swirling, men in clean shirts and polished boots, pride thick in the air. Elias Dawson stood near the entrance, hat in hand, vest neat, his posture calm. He had arrived alone and waited without impatience, his gaze fixed on the door. Then it opened. Annie stepped inside. The music faltered. Conversations died mid-word. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. She moved forward one step at a time, her skirt brushing the floor, the green-blue fabric setting off her dark skin in lamplight. Her body filled the space with undeniable presence. She was not small. She was not meant to be. Whispers rippled through the crowd. She's got nerve. Where'd she get that dress? Thinks that makes her fit to be here. Annie's heart pounded. Her hands shook at her sides. For one terrible moment, she considered turning back, leaving with her dignity intact. Then Elias was there. He crossed the room without hesitation and took her hand. His grip was warm, firm, grounding. "With me," he said quietly. He led her toward the center of the floor, beneath the great golden lamp. The crowd parted, forming a wide circle, eyes fixed, breath held. Annie felt exposed, every inch of her seen, judged, weighed. Elias placed his hand at her back, steady as the land he worked. He met her gaze, blue eyes unwavering. "They don't matter," he said softly. The fiddle struck up again. At first, Annie's feet moved stiffly, her body tense beneath the stairs, but gradually Elias guided her with slow, certain steps, his hold never loosening. The rhythm found her. Her skirt turned, the fabric caught the lamplight like water. Her body, so often called too much, moved with strength and grace. Laughter bubbled from her chest, surprising even herself. The music swelled. Other couples joined. Boots pounded. The hall came alive again. But Annie knew something had already changed. When the song ended, applause broke out, hesitant at first, then fuller. Annie faltered, instinct urging her to step away. Elias held firm. "Don't," he murmured. "Stand." She did. The next tune leapt lively and bright. Annie laughed freely now, unguarded, spinning beneath the lights. Her joy cut through the room sharper than any whisper. Elias laughed too, rare and easy, their movements matched without effort. They danced again and again. The whispers thinned, drowned by music and motion, not erased, but challenged. When the dance finally slowed, Annie stood breathless beneath the lamp, her face flushed, eyes shining. She lifted her chin and looked around the hall. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a trespasser. She felt present, seen, equal. Elias bowed slightly, still holding her hand. Annie returned the gesture, composed and proud. The crowd applauded, not for defiance, not for spectacle, but for what could not be denied. A woman had stood in the light and refused to shrink, and Cottonwood Springs, whether ready or not, had been forced to witness it.
The red dust road to Denver stretched long and unforgiving beneath the autumn sun. When Elias Dawson rode away from Wildflower Ranch, the sound of hoofbeats faded slowly, each echo pressing heavier into Annie Callahan's chest than she expected. She stood at the gate long after he disappeared, one hand resting on the fence, the other clenched at her side. 2 weeks, he had said. Only business. Annie nodded, but absence had a way of revealing truths people worked hard not to name. The first morning without Elias arrived cold and quiet. The ranch did not pause to grieve. Cattle still needed water. Fences still sagged. Winter crept closer with every pale dawn. Annie rose before the sun, tied back her hair, and stepped into the work that waited. By mid-morning, the hired hands stood idle, glancing toward the house, uncertain. They had never answered to her alone. Annie felt the weight of their gaze, the old doubt pressing in. She drew a breath and spoke. "Frank, check the west pasture. Harvey, fix the creek trough. I'll finish the north fence." Her voice was calm, certain. The men nodded and went. The day moved smoother than she expected. Decisions came sharp and clear. When rain threatened, she shifted tasks. When supplies ran thin, she rationed without complaint. At night, she sat at the rough table in her cabin, oil lamp glowing, and wrote in the leather-bound journal Elias had given her. "Day one without him," she wrote. "The ranch stands." Days passed, then more. Respect grew quietly. Frank muttered once, almost to himself, "You plan cleaner than Dawson." Annie said nothing, but the words warmed her like fire. When Elias returned, the ranch had changed. Fences stood straight, the barn swept clean, cattle lowed healthy and calm. The land bore the mark of steady hands. Elias saw it all. That evening, as dusk painted the hills in violet and gold, he and Annie rode together to the high ridge overlooking the fields. The wind lifted her skirt, tugged at his coat. The land stretched wide and waiting below them. "This place needs a name," Elias said. Annie turned. "A name?" He continued. "A spirit, and someone to hold it with me." The meaning settled between them, heavy and sure. Annie thought of the years she had spent shrinking beneath judgment, of every door closed, every word meant to make her small. She thought of the way Elias had looked at her from the first, without pity, without doubt. She reached for his hand. That spring, Cottonwood Springs gathered again for its festival, but this time Annie did not enter with trembling hands or borrowed courage. She stood beside Elias at the center of the crowd, her presence solid and undeniable. Whispers stirred, but they lacked teeth now. Elias lifted his voice, calm and clear. "Before every watching eye, I choose her." Silence fell. Annie did not rush her answer. She met the town's gaze, every woman who had whispered, every man who had looked past her. Then she nodded once. The wedding came beneath an open sky. Wildflowers carpeted the hillsides, purple and gold swaying in the wind. Annie wore a modest white dress sewn by women from the town, a quiet gesture of change. Elias stood beside her, nothing grand about him but his certainty. When they spoke their vows, the wind carried the words far. They named the land Wildflower Ranch. Years passed, marked by seasons and work. The ranch flourished. Annie rode beside Elias, managed accounts, hired hands, taught children their letters at the kitchen table. People came not just for trade, but for counsel. The whispers faded. One evening, Annie sat on the porch watching her children run through the grass, laughter ringing bright. Elias joined her, dusty and smiling, and drew her close. "They said I wasn't fit to be anyone's wife," Annie said quietly. Elias squeezed her hand. She smiled, gazed steady on the land she helped build. "Turns out all it takes is one person willing to believe." The prairie wind carried the scent of wildflowers higher, and the story of Annie Callahan, once shunned, now chosen, settled into the earth itself, unmovable and true.